Well, I want to thank you all for, on my birthday, coming to 3 services. It's a very nice present that you all did for me. Thank you. Well, there's an old saying, first impressions are everything. And this is the principle that guides the work of Carlos Cervantes and Roby Donovan. They're 2 men who know what it's like to be in prison. And their philosophy is that the first few hours that a person finds themselves released are the most important. For example, recently when 65-year-old Dahlman walked out of prison after 21 years, he was met by Carlos and Roby. And when he emerged from the gate, Carlos shouted, "Welcome home, Mr. Hammock." And Roby shouted, "How are you feeling, Mr. Hammock?" And Mr. Hammock just stood there stunned. And they came to him and they took his possessions, which was 1 brown paper bag and some old work boots. They put them in their car, and then they told him who they were and what organization they were with. And they spent the day with him. They took him out to eat. They bought him some new clothes. They gave him advice. They swapped stories. They pulled out these magical devices called cell phones where they could pull up on Facebook images of his niece and nephew that he had never seen in seconds. And he was astonished. And then they just went and sat on the beach by the water and let him think. This is not the way people typically walk out of prison. Their friend Julio told a story. He was paroled in 2013 before the program started. He described stopping at the IHOP near the prison for breakfast when he was released. And he described it like a horrifying fever dream. He said he sat there looking for snipers, trying to be on his best behavior. And he was shocked when they set a metal knife and a fork next to him. And then he spent the rest of the breakfast guarding his silverware, thinking someone would grab it and use it to kill him. It wasn't until he went to the restroom and a man greeted him coming out of the restroom. "How you doing, buddy?" And he said, "Fine." That he said, "I suddenly felt like I might be a legitimate part of this environment." But what if, Carlos and Roby asked, if their friend had bumped into a waitress and knocked over her tray of dishes? What if the man getting out of the bathroom had just stared at him or said, "Get out of my way"? His welcome could have been a lot different. Well, this morning we get to learn how to be like Carlos and Roby. This morning, Jesus gives us an example of how to set people free who are in bondage. But if we're going to understand the story of the bent-over woman in our gospel reading this morning, we need a little context of what's happening in Luke 13. You see, there's this long-standing debate among the Jewish leaders about why bad things happen. And some teachers said bad things happen because God is punishing us for wrong things we've done. But that's not what Jesus said. At the beginning of the chapter, some men come up to Jesus and they say, "What about all those Galileans that Pilate killed while they were worshiping Jesus?" And he said, "Do you think those murdered Galileans were worse sinners than all the other Galileans? Not at all. But unless you turn to God, you too will die." And those 18, remember the number 18, in Jerusalem the other day, the ones crushed and killed when the Tower of Siloam fell, do you think they were worse than all the other citizens of Jerusalem? Not at all. But unless you turn to God, you too will die. We want Jesus to tell us, why do bad things happen? And he simply reminds us of the hard fact that all of us are going to die. And he gives us the truth that bad things do not happen as a punishment for evil from God. He said those Galileans murdered by Pilate, they were no worse than anyone else. Those people on whom the tower fell, they were no worse than anyone else. Every one of us here is in the same boat with them. The ones the world would call the best and the ones the world would call the worst. Each of us, whether we know it or not, is dependent. We're dependent on God. We're dependent on each other. We're dependent on community. And the sooner we realize it, the sooner we will find life. And then we come to our reading this morning. Jesus is teaching in the meeting place on the Sabbath. And there's a woman present, and she's twisted and bent over with some sickness. And we don't know what's wrong with her. In Greek, Luke calls it a spirit of infirmity. It could have been an injury. It could have been arthritis. It could have been psychosomatic. We don't know. Whatever was wrong with her, the text tells us that her spirit has been impacted by her illness. Her condition is such that she can't even physically look up. And we know that she's had this for 18 years. Gospel writers don't use common numbers to connect things to earlier parts of the story by accident. It's important that we notice that number. And most importantly, we know that in a small village where everybody knows everybody, in a culture where people think bad things happen to you because you're bad, people probably did not think too much of this woman. Think about that. Think about all the baggage laying on this woman's shoulders when Jesus calls to her and says, "Woman, you are free." He laid his hands on her, and suddenly she's standing straight and tall. Imagine what it would be like to only see feet. For 18 years, only to see nasty, dirty, from dusty streets and animal dropping feet. And suddenly you can look someone in the eye and imagine the first person you look in the eye after 18 years is Jesus. Someone who doesn't think you are a sinner. Someone who doesn't think you're worse than anyone else in the village. Imagine being set free. The problem is that woman was not the only one in bondage. The meeting place president is furious. Jesus has healed on the Sabbath, and he tells the congregation, 6 days are for work. If you want to be healed, come on one of those days, but not the Sabbath. And everyone knows it's passive-aggressive. Everyone knows it's directed at Jesus. And Jesus replies, "You frauds." Double standard. Every Sabbath, each one of you regularly unties your animals from their stalls. You lead them to water. You think nothing of it. You feed them. Why should this daughter of Abraham, who's been bound by Satan these 18 years, not be set free? You see, the president of the synagogue, like the people who believed bad things only happened to you if you were bad, were both in prison. The prison was guarded by their own desire to prove their righteousness by pointing out the faults of others. It seems like the president of the synagogue thought that the law and the Sabbath were there to prove who's the most righteous and who could keep it the best. And it seems that Jesus thought the Sabbath was so common laborers couldn't be forced to work endlessly without a break, so even animals could receive a break, and so people would slow down and rest and focus on God. For Jesus, the Sabbath is deliverance. And Luke tells us in this gospel that what Jesus has done for this woman, he wants to do for Israel, and he wants to do for us, the reader. Jesus wants us to be free, but the task is enormous. The problems of the world are great. So how do we begin? Well, Carlos and Roby started by trying to set people free in their minds by working in the anti-recidivism coalition. It's a hard word. The ARC hired Carlos, a man just out of prison himself, to give someone a ride, and it was supposed to just be a short-term job. And so he picks up this guy, Terry Critton, from prison in Chino, and on the way back, Terry says, "Can we stop and look at jazz records?" So they stopped and looked at jazz LPs, because Terry had been a big collector, and they spent 2 hours looking at jazz albums. And then Crittenden wanted a patty melt, so they found a place called Fluky's and ate a patty melt, and then they caught the end of the Dodgers game. And Carlos said, as he's working with this man this day, he became a living, breathing human again. Interacting, full of hope. And he said it was extraordinary, and he was hooked, and he wanted to spend the rest of his life doing that. And today, Carlos and his friend are officially the ARC's Ride Home program. Well, here's the truth. At the cross, all of creation was set free. This is why when you go into most Episcopal churches, you see this cross behind you with Jesus victorious. Jesus going out to change the world. Recently, a new friend in Shawnee asked me if I was saved. He said, "Father Tom, are you saved?" And I said, "Of course I'm saved." And he said, "Well, when were you saved?" And I knew what he meant, but I also knew what he needed to hear. And I said, "Well, I was saved 2,000 years ago on the hill of Calvary." And then I reminded him, most people stop at John 3:16, but 17 says, "For God did not send his Son into the world to condemn the world, but that the world might be saved through him." So if by the cross God has thrown open the doors of the prison and creation, including us, are set free, then those of us who know it are the Ride Home program. Most of us who claim the name of Jesus in this world exercise our faith like a prisoner recently released in the IHOP looking for snipers, worried someone's going to take our silverware and kill us. Most of us look like we were weaned on a sour pickle. Oh, that's a really good joke. That's better than... We're like that synagogue president, and we insist that everyone in the world look in the world and think just like us. And if this describes you, you are perfect for the Ride Home program, because we need people who know what prison is like. This morning, Jesus has given us a simple mission. We get to stand at the gate and yell, "Welcome home. How are you feeling? Would you like to go look at jazz LPs? Maybe get a patty melt and catch the end of the Dodgers game?" Jesus has set us free.